Hello film fans, and welcome to this episode of the Sherlockian. Now, recently I finally got round to watching a film that I'd been meaning to watch for ages. Kenneth Branagh's Murder on the Orient Express. Now, for those of you who haven't seen this film, it's a modern retelling, if you like, of Agatha Christie's famous murder mystery, Murder on the Orient Express, featuring probably her most famous detective, Hercule Poirot. Now, the reason I finally got round to watching this was after a conversation with one of my cousins, when she said that she didn't particularly like Kenneth Branagh's version of Poirot, and that she preferred David Suchet. Now, I have to be honest, I've never been a particularly big fan of either Agatha Christie or Hercule Poirot as a character. I think it's mainly down to the fact that I prefer murder mysteries which focus more on the characters than on the mystery itself. So, for instance, things like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, or Dorothy L. Sayers, Lord Peter Wimsey, tend to focus more on the characters involved in the mystery rather than the mystery itself. And I think it makes for a better story rather than a book that's wholly focused on trying to solve a mystery. I think it makes for better rereading, and I just enjoy it a bit more, just generally. But after hearing about this criticism of Kenneth Branagh, if you like, I decided to give Branagh's version of Poirot a watch, and I was actually quite pleasantly surprised. Now, I have to say before I really get into why I particularly liked Kenneth Branagh in the role, that I am quite a big fan of David Suchet in general, and his portrayal of Poirot in particular. I particularly like how he really got down the sort of fussiness of the character. I mean, he really brings the character off the page. It feels very similar to how Christie portrayed him in the book. But I have to be honest, my most favourite retelling of the Poirot character, if you like, was actually probably, before seeing Kenneth Branagh in the role, Ronnie Barker, who portrayed him quite a few times in the BBC comedy show The Two Ronnies.
Poirot? You don't mean you invited Hercule Poirot, the detective, here for the weekend?
He's a very good friend of the bishop's.
The man is a walking jinx, my dear. I mean, he's only got to set foot in a place and people get horribly murdered.
Don't be so preposterous.
What about that society wedding he was at last year, when 6 of the bride's family got slaughtered with a cake knife? Or that holiday hotel in Scotland, when 4 of the house guests choked to death on a septic haggis? I'm not getting murdered. He comes to this house, my dear, over my dead body. Once and for all, Sydney, he is not welcome under my roof.
I think that Barker really got down one of the reasons why I've always had mixed feelings about Poirot as a character. I know he's technically a Belgian detective, but I'd always seen him as, a real sort of list of French stereotypes, such as the English see them, really. So he's particularly fussy, he's obsessed with food, he's quite small, and it just seems to me a bit of a kind of, dig at the French from a very English author. Now, that's not to say that I necessarily disapprove of this method of writing detective stories. Obviously, having a detective lead that stands out is, one of the real mainstays of detective fiction, if you like. If you look at all the most famous detective stories, they, generally speaking, have a lead that most people remember. You only have to look at Sherlock Holmes, Lord Peter Wimsey, Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple. Every single detective author tries to create a character that's memorable. But what always sort of annoyed me about Poirot was that he seems, almost a caricature of a real man. That's not to say that Lord Peter Wimsey or indeed Sherlock Holmes don't have aspects of caricature in them. But you can imagine meeting people like that just about, whereas Poirot to me always seemed, a bit over the top. What I really liked about Kenneth Branagh's version is he sort of brings it back to the real world. So, for instance, he sort of sees Poirot the character as someone with kind of obsessive compulsive disorder, someone that really obsesses about very small things, and as a result it gives him great powers of observation. He can see things that are out of place, and he uses this to solve crimes. We see this particularly at the start of the film, where he solves a crime at the Wailing Wall, which I particularly liked. I think it really set the scene of the time period. It's part of the British mandate over Palestine, and you really get a real overview of the times Poirot is living in. But what I particularly liked about Branagh's portrayal of Poirot as a character in this film is that he kind of breaks down Poirot's very black and white view of morality. Poirot starts off the film essentially with the idea that there is good in the world and bad, and he, as a good man, is destined to fight the bad. But over the course of the film, Poirot finds this, very black and white view of the world increasingly challenged, and part of that is to do with the crime that's actually committed. Essentially, it's a crime of vengeance. A group of people all book rooms on the Orient Express. They've all been wronged by a particularly murderous gangster who's in the process of kidnapping a young child several years earlier, has murdered her and left her for dead, and as a result ruined quite a few lives in the process. It's actually a crime based on the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's eldest son, also called Charles, but known as Buster, which was never solved. And this particularly horrible crime basically causes the people involved to take justice into their own hands. Now, in the David Suchet version of this film, which was filmed, I think, about 2010, when Poirot finally discovers what's gone on, he seems outraged. There's real anger. He says that, justice, if it falls in the dirt, it should be picked up again. It shouldn't be taken into the hands of amateurs. People shouldn't go out simply and commit mob violence. Why should humans behave like animals? And he seems outraged by this. And while I wouldn't necessarily say he's wrong, I mean, certainly, generally speaking, vigilantism simply leads to more heartbreak and emotional trauma overall, particularly among the people that actually carry it out. I would say it shows, in the scene, a particular misunderstanding of, the dreadful trauma that the people involved have gone through. Whereas Kenneth Branagh's Poirot is more torn, I think is the right word. He seems generally confused as to what his next step should be. He says, a terrible crime has been committed, and another terrible crime has also been committed, but does the second crime score out the first crime? He doesn't really know. And you can see in the final scene when he confronts the people involved in the crime, in a very Agatha Christie scene. Agatha Christie obviously loved the final confrontation scene, where the detective, often Poirot, but sometimes Miss Marple, gathers together all the suspects and says, and the infamous murderer was, and then says the name of whoever it was. In this scene, Poirot generally seems confused as to what should happen, and in a scene that really, I found quite chilling, he actually offers, for them to murder him rather than him basically having to come to a decision on the subject. Although it does turn out that this is obviously a trick to see whether they're willing to murder again. I mean, it turns out they're not, and as a result, Poirot feels content to let them get on with their lives and to mislead the Yugoslavian police. But I just, really liked this portrayal in general. I thought Poirot, as portrayed by Branagh, he still has many of the traits of Poirot. He's fussy, but he, as well as having this quite stereotypical attitude, if you like, it does still seem like a normal person. He's very quiet, very refined. Kenneth Branagh does an excellent job of portraying him as a person. He really seems, quite likeable. You can understand why people confide in him. So, yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised by this portrayal of the character. I mean, I never thought, to be honest, that I would ever actually like Poirot as a character, but I was, pleasantly surprised by this version. Actually, it really makes me want to go and watch Death on the Nile, which is obviously the sequel that Kenneth Branagh has made fairly recently to Murder on the Orient Express, because I enjoyed this one so much. So yeah, that was the Sherlockian. Thank you very much for watching, film fans, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.